All right. So my presentation is far less visual in terms of images and things. I apologize. I plead jet lag. It's almost as many time zones away from home for me being here as is possible. But it's been lovely. Thank you all. It's the incredible hospitality, wonderful place. My first time in Armenia, but hopefully it will not be the last. So what I wanted to talk to all of you about is the idea of teaching, and teaching inside a professional engineering team. I think it's incredibly important. I think it's something that does happen sort of automatically the way we work, but I think it's worth focusing on and emphasizing because I think it brings about some really important and really positive outcomes when you do it. Let's see if I can, there we go. All right. So really brief summary of why I think this is important and sort of what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of organizational debt, sort of things you accrue as you do your work that slow you down, how that in particular reflects in sort of isolated knowledge where individuals on your team know things that other people don't, and that actually contributes to the slowdown of work. Training and teaching as a useful tool to limit that. So ways to get knowledge out of one person's head and into more people's head. And ways you can just build it into how your team works. So you don't have to stop and do a big event and a big production to try and do training. It just becomes sort of a routine in how you work day in and day out. Super quick recap, it's not super interesting. As you've heard, I worked previously at Twitter with Rafi and several of the other folks here. More recently, I've worked at Urban Airship, which is a mobile platform company in Portland. I also work at a small liberal arts college in Portland, Oregon called Reed, famous mostly for Steve Jobs having dropped out of there. And I work there actually teaching undergrads who aren't studying computer science how to code. So it's near and dear to my heart. I've been in the industry a little over 15 years. The last 5 of that I've worked as a manager and director. But I'm particularly interested in working with sort of team structure and process to make people work better, which is a common thread, I think, of everybody who's talking today. So I won't dwell on it too much. So this is a really fundamental question to me, like what's wrong with just doing the work? And I think you're going to hear a bunch of sort of perspectives on this today, but you know, it's a totally reasonable perspective to say, why bother with all of this meta stuff? Like if we just put our head down and we just crank out code, like probably it'll all be fine. And I don't think that's actually true. It might be true in the short term, but I think it leads to some really sort of potentially toxic things. So I mean, here's like a really normal story, right, for a team working on something. You're very successful early on. You build a great thing. Awesome, like success, party, like money, everybody's happy. Now you're ambitious. You want to do more than you're doing already, more than you've done in the past. That often means adding people, like growing the team, growing the capability and the throughput you have. So in theory, with a bigger team, with these ambitious goals, you should be doing a lot more. And yet what you tend to find is that teams get slower as they get bigger. They may be doing more work, but the net work per person usually goes down. David talked about one reason for this, which is the cost of sort of cross-communication between members of the team, but that's not the only reason. Other factors sort of creep in that cause this sort of slowdown to happen, and it can be really frustrating if you're part of this early dynamic team that was just building stuff all the time, and now you're 2-3 times the size and everything's slowing down and it's just frustrating. And so this is where I think we start to think about the debt we accrue as an organization as we work. So probably at least a lot of you are familiar with this concept of technical debt. You take shortcuts, you move fast to get something out into the market, and you leave a mess behind. And you know you want to go back and clean it up eventually. Maybe the code, like your test coverage drops, or you have tight cohesion between modules or other things you want to avoid, but you don't get around to it right away because you want to get something into the hands of users. But you end up with the same kind of thing in how your team operates, the way you structure your company, the way you do your process. You end up with organizational debt. You may have seen writing about this from folks like Ben Horowitz as management debt, same concept. Just things you defer that your company or your team should be doing that you don't do because it's not code. So as your team gets better, as you try to do more stuff, you're going to accrue both of these kinds of debt, and they're both going to be a problem. However, as software developers, we're pretty well trained to spot issues in our code. We know the technical debt that we're accruing because we just read the code and we're like, who wrote this? Oh, me? That's terrible. I have to fix that. But the organizational debt can be kind of invisible. It's not related to how we code. We just feel it as this sort of frustrating friction and slowdown in our work. Not enough is getting done. And it's a million tiny things, but it's tough to point down at one cause and say, like this, if we just rewrote this, or if we just took this one meeting out of the schedule or whatever, it would all be fine. So there are a bunch of types of organizational debt that you end up with, and these are success problems, right? These are because you're being successful and you're growing and you're taking on more and more ambitious and larger projects. One of them is, you just have managers that aren't there. They're stretched too thin, they haven't had training, and this is a whole problem worthy of a talk of its own coming up later today, so I think that'll be great. You end up with a lot of overwork and burnout, often from some of the best, most productive people on the team, right? They can easily become heroes and try and do everything and burn themselves out completely, and then they can't do anything. You end up with poor communication across teams. If you take David's advice and keep the teams small and split things out into a lot of teams, suddenly they're not talking to each other as much as they should be, and mistrust or misunderstandings can build there. And then the one that I really want to focus on today, because I think it actually contributes to numbers 2 and 3, is this case where you have sort of solitary, lonely experts, and they're the one person in your team or your organization who understands how some critical thing works, and you have to go to them every time something related to that comes up. And I think that can be really dangerous. So lone experts, right? Like everybody wants to be an expert. It's a really good feeling to be the expert on something in your team or in your industry, right? Like that's a great feeling, and it's not a bad thing in and of itself to develop expertise, and you want to have experts on your team. But the lone part is really the problem, because now you're talking about a person. It's not a team, it's not an organization, it's not a self-healing thing. And so because they're still just people, we have this problem we talked about, like suddenly they're on the critical path for every project. You have one person who understands performance in your database, and only one. And now every time you want to make a change, they've got to be on board. They've got to help, they've got to give you input, feedback, advice. And so now every project is bottlenecked on them. As I said, it also reinforces other forms of organizational debt. So if that one person is constantly cranking as hard as they can and trying to put out all of the fires, they're going to work too hard, they're going to burn out. Other teams are going to feel like they're not getting what they need from that person. It can lead to sort of a breakdown in communication across teams. And the reality is, no matter how happy, no matter how effective somebody is, they're not going to be a part of your team forever. Right? Like everybody has a career trajectory that involves, maybe they're going to move to a different project within your company. Maybe they're going to go work for a different company. Maybe they're going to take 6 months off to hike in Nepal and like just stop coding entirely. You can't completely control for that. And so if one person leaving the organization can cripple your ability to execute on certain types of projects, that's really bad. That puts the organization at risk, and as a leader, you need to control for that. Not to say, again, throw out all the experts, but don't let yourself become completely blocked on this one person. So how do we break this cycle, right? We've got really great people who are trying to do the right thing and yet ending up in this bad place. So we want to provide some tools as an organization to get out of that. And the really simple rule you want to follow is just always have more than one expert on anything that's really critical, right? So you always want to have more than one person. They may not have totally equal expertise, but you should have somebody who can back up that expert, who can offer an informed opinion and support any team who's trying to do something in that domain. So the first option, and this is a totally legitimate option, and when you can do it, it's totally worth doing, is just to hire more people who know about that thing, right? So it works really well when you have commodity off-the-shelf software, right? If you're using an Oracle database in the core of your product, you can probably hire 2 or 3 or 4 Oracle DBAs who understand how that software works and can tune it and can support it. Unfortunately, most of us are probably writing some of our own code, right? We're not just wiring together plug-in, easy off-the-shelf pieces. They may form part of our system, but we're gonna have some custom secret sauce application logic that we've written and we're maintaining, and we're gonna have experts in that code in-house. So hiring is seldom gonna be a complete solution for that. Do it where you can, but know that it won't cover everything. And so then I would argue that the second option is to spread the knowledge around in the form of teaching. You need to get that knowledge out of the expert's head and into other people's head with as little extra, ceremony or friction as possible. A lot of people will try to hire tech writers to come in and document every system, and it's usually a very lossy process to take information from one engineer, translate it through a tech writer, and give it to another batch of engineers as like a bunch of written documentation. It's good to have as a backup, but it's not as efficient, and it doesn't convey the same nuance. So when you're teaching, when you set up a culture of teaching, your current expert or experts are gonna turn other team members or members of other teams into fellow experts. It's as simple as that. But it does require you to invest time and energy and thought to make it work and to make it systematic. So, all that being said, there are some other reasons why I think it's really important to do ongoing training and teaching within your organization. You really can't teach something that you don't understand, right? You can try, but it's gonna be hard. The minute you get a question and you just go, I don't know, like there, boom, gaps in your knowledge have been pointed out, and that's fine, that happens. That's an opportunity to go back and learn that and figure that out. But to really be able to sit down and train somebody in a focused, coherent way in a technology requires you to understand it really well. Because you need to not only know your script, but be able to respond to any questions that they give you. And there's this other thing that happens when you have sort of pervasive training and when it's not restricted to people immediately on the team of the trainer. You build a lot of empathy and understanding across teams. If I, offer a lunchtime talk on a technology and I invite folks from outside of my team and they come in and we interact there and we have a good conversation and Q&A and everything, odds are we're gonna think well of each other from that, right? It's a good meeting of minds and a good way to feel like peers, even though we don't get to work together all the time. So the good news is, if you're following sort of what's considered best practices in software engineering anyway, you're probably doing a lot of teaching. You just may not realize it, right? Code review is a teaching opportunity. It's maybe more of a Socratic dialogue type of teaching opportunity, but it's still an opportunity to transfer knowledge both from the implementer to the reviewer and from the reviewers back to the implementer in terms of patterns or anti-patterns or style or whatever. New hire training. Quick show of hands, how many people have a formal new hire training program at the place where they work? It's not very many. I highly, highly recommend it. It may not seem super important when you're tiny and it's just, oh, we've hired our 6th person, like go sit next to Bob, go sit next to Jane, they'll teach you everything you need to know. Unfortunately, that really, really doesn't scale. It takes time away. Just do it sooner than you think you need it, and trust me, it really does help. But design reviews, root cause analysis, any of the other stuff you're doing to build your product and to take input from your peers is an opportunity to teach if you approach it as that. So you don't need an extra heavyweight process. Mentorship, another really important thing that I think people tend to neglect until much later in their career. Having a mentor and being a mentor, that's a teaching relationship. That's an opportunity to, in a really high bandwidth, like one-on-one sort of way, share a ton of knowledge. And I think it's worth everybody, if you haven't found a mentor, ideally within the organization where you're working is great, if there's somebody really senior who you respect. But if not, go out, find somebody, have somebody who can help you get better faster, and exploit that as a teaching relationship. And if you're in a leadership position and you're in a position to sort of define what the job of senior developers in your organization is, make mentorship part of it. Evaluate them on it and call it part of their job. Make sure that they are mentoring more junior people. And the process of giving a talk, right? It can be as casual as a lunchtime tutorial. It can be as formal as flying to another country and delivering a presentation. That's a teaching opportunity too. And it benefits the teacher as well. Like I said, fills in gaps in knowledge. You get feedback, you get all kinds of useful information, but hopefully you're also spreading that out to the larger organization. So that's like the basics. That's the stuff hopefully everyone is just thinking about. How are we spreading knowledge around the organization? How are we eliminating these sort of lone experts who are going to be under constant pressure and strain? And how are we leveling up everybody else? So once you've got that kind of stuff in place, then you can start thinking a little more about sort of pedagogy, about how you go about teaching, about how the organization goes about encouraging that. So everything I've talked about so far has been mostly sort of casual ad hoc, just fit it into the normal working day. And then you can get into this idea of actually delivering formal trainings. Like, we have a 2-hour tutorial on MySQL query optimization. It will be offered, these days. How do you set up something like that? Ideally, somebody, and often this isn't going to be someone in management. This is going to be somebody on an engineering team who's just watching the flow of changes and tickets and emails and notices, hey, there are a lot of questions coming up on this system. A lot of people want to know how to do X. And sometimes I can answer those questions sort of in the moment, but often I can't. And so maybe it would be more efficient to sort of package up a bunch of information about that and deliver it all at once, right? And so, great, so now you've found a need. There's a gap in people's knowledge, and you feel like either you can fill it or you know someone who could. So go develop just a really basic thing. It doesn't have to be an expert master class, ready for university, quality. It could be very casual, slides like the ones I'm using today. Spend some time, put some information together, and deliver it. And then the really important thing is deliver it and make sure that you're getting feedback from the folks you delivered it to. This is another iterative process, just like any engineering task we take on. So don't just throw it out there and then move on. Take feedback, revise it, report out on what happened, right? Like, oh, it turns out, talk to your manager, talk to your peers, say like, it turns out when I tried to deliver this kind of thing without actually having any hands-on keyboard time, it just sort of went right past people. It didn't really process. I think I'm gonna try it again with a hands-on tutorial in the middle. So we'll spend an hour talking and we'll spend a half-hour coding and we'll come back for a half-hour wrap-up, right? That's great. Now you've learned that, now share that with anybody else who might be in a position to do training inside your organization. And then repeat. Most of the time, these trainings aren't something you would only ever deliver once. You're gonna hire new people. People are gonna change teams or roles. So be ready to offer it again. And so this is where developing a cadence, this is where it becomes a pattern. People talk about this a lot with building any sort of positive habit, whether it's working out or reading nonfiction or whatever it is you want to do to improve yourself. It has to become a habit rather than a thing you grit your teeth and do every so often because it seems healthy. So set up a regular cadence of training, and it doesn't have to be that your one solo training course is the only one that's ever done, but have a regular thing. Like I said, a really lightweight way is just a once a week, have a lunchtime thing. Order in sandwiches and have somebody every week get up and give a brief training to everybody else. Doesn't have to be heavyweight, doesn't have to be complex, but the more you do it on a regular basis, the more you sort of get used to it. Again, the same training, doing it more than once, usually means you'll get better at it, and the people who couldn't participate the first time but will really benefit from it now get a chance. So the more times you do it, the wider the audience you reach and the higher the quality is. And then if you want to get really slick, you should get to the point where once you've delivered the training to somebody, and maybe they've then worked with the thing you trained them on, they can turn around and deliver the training themselves, right? That's a great sort of apprentice becoming the journeyman or master sort of cycle to set up, right? Because now you've not only removed all responsibility for technical work on that subject from the expert, you've removed the responsibility for delivering all the training. So now you have a scalable training process, not just a scalable technology. So just a couple of parting thoughts to wrap up here. I don't want to imply here that teaching is easy, right? Anyone who's tried to work as a teacher or who's understood the difference between a really excellent teacher and a weak teacher in an academic setting or a professional training setting knows it's not something that just anybody can get up and like teach. First of all, it's not just talking at people. It's supposed to be conversational. There should be give and take. There should be adaptation to the audience. So I'm going to go out of order here and talk a little bit more about this adaptation. Training ideally should be sort of scalable is an overloaded term. It's used to mean too much, but you should be able to add and remove things from it based on the audience you're working with. So if you have a really junior set of new developers, they may not be able to go into all the details that you want to offer in sort of your eventual training. And so ideally, be ready to throw stuff out on the fly. Don't leave people behind by trying to hammer on content that they're not ready for. Give the overview, and maybe you stop there and come back later to give more of the detail. But by the same token, if folks are just breezing through the overview material, be ready to go deeper. Again, to that point, if you really understand the techniques or the technology you're talking about, you should be able to teach them. You should be able to share as much of the detailed stuff you know as the audience is ready for. And then the aspect of taking feedback, not just delivering a lecture, that's something that should really be highlighted as an example of being a leader, like a senior engineer, senior developer, or a good, effective manager, is you need to be able to do that adaptability. You need to be able to take the feedback, not just barrel forward with the type of training and the type of learning experience that you initially wanted to deliver. And the other sort of good piece of news is that organizations, leaders in organizations, can help to make this easier, right? It doesn't all have to be on the back of these overworked experts to set up these opportunities and set up these trainings. So one of the big things you can do is, as we've talked about a bunch, people tend to optimize towards whatever they're being rewarded for, right? If you say your goal is X and you will be rewarded if you achieve it, then people will move towards that goal. So as a leader, somebody who shapes the way the organization thinks, you should be setting goals for people that involve teaching. Like, hey, it's really great that you have mastered this technology. Awesome, true mastery includes teaching. So let me help you find the time and the opportunities to do that. And so, looking for that gap, for that need as a leadership team is really important. And so, yeah, just really, I would say if you have a formal performance review process, if that feeds into promotion considerations, make it part of it, right? Like, make it part of the job description for your lead engineers that they are constantly teaching the more junior engineers, not just wrenching the keyboard away and doing the work themselves, for all the reasons I talked about before. And that's it. So I would love to take some questions. I saw a hand go up really fast over there. So the question, I think if I can summarize it, was how do you compare the sort of cost of just documenting things you've implemented versus delivering formal training on that thing? Yeah, the pros and cons. When do you just document? When do you provide training? I think the cost of training is higher, right? It's like all the cost of documentation plus human interaction. But I think we're wired much better to actually receive and process the information when it's coming in the form of human interaction. So documentation is great as a backstop, as a fallback. I don't think it generally works all that well, except for very simple cases, right? I think it works well for just learning the Surface API or learning the basic syntax of a thing. But you're very quickly, when you try to practice, use a technology, you're going to fall into the sort of nooks and crannies, the things that aren't accounted for in the documentation. So yes, have the documentation for getting started. I actually think it's a great preamble to training to be able to send people some basic documentation and say, read this so you have at least the skeleton of what we're going to talk about. And then once you've read that, you'll be prepared to come in and understand what I'm training you on and ask questions. So I don't think you can get away with not doing documentation, but I don't think long term it actually has a super high value except as a starting point. So that would sort of be my stance. There were some hands in the middle, but yeah. There's a mic coming.
Hi, so my question is the following. How do you find the time for mentorship? What I mean is that in many cases you have a project, you have a deadline, and you have a good employee who has the experience to deliver everything on time and with the quality. On the other hand, you have the dilemma to teach the newer employee, right? Mm-hmm. So in many cases, we have the issue to decide which one is the right path to go with. So totally. What would you do? Like, what's the right thing? And totally. The second question, like I actually have the other question. Like, can you give me like a proportion of how much time you spend daily or like weekly on mentorship of other employees?
Totally.
Thank you.
That's a great question. Like, how do you prioritize mentorship versus doing? There isn't a single right answer. Like, there's not just a number where I can say, oh, 15% of your time should be spent doing mentorship. Because it depends a lot on where the organization is. What's your trajectory? How fast are you bringing in new people? How fast are you losing people? You have to sort of observe those things, and as a leader, you really need to balance them and experiment and try. If you're not leaving any time for mentorship or training, I can say you're probably too far in the extreme. Even if somebody's doing great work week in and week out, and they're constantly delivering to spec, to schedule, if they're not taking any time to mentor and train others on what they did and why and how, then you're setting up for that organizational debt, right? You're sort of going fast now, but you're not paying down the organizational debt. You're letting the knowledge accumulate in that one person. So it's kind of a balance, right? Maybe deadlines happen, right? Sometimes you just have to put all hands on deck, get this thing out the door, but then hopefully you have a lull after that. You've hit your deadline. Great, now it's time for a retrospective. Now it's time to sort of maybe in your follow-on, you've got some bugs, you've got some minor enhancements that have come on for that big thing you just launched. Put those in the hands of the junior people, make some time for training and support from the senior people who did the first launch. You can't keep everybody cranked to 100% head down coding all the time, or it's just going to burn you. So there's not a single right answer. I think it should be more than none, less than all, probably less than half. People should still be coding to maintain and develop new expertise. That's part of the point, is like let them offload this so they can go find the new thing that they want to learn and become an expert on. But it just depends. And there's always the individuals who really struggle with it, right? Like, not every software developer is the most social, verbally communicative person. And you want them to do some amount of training and some amount of mentoring, because again, you can't just let them accumulate all the expertise in a problem. But maybe you don't lean on them quite as hard as the really social, like, talkative one who's happy to jump into a room with a bunch of new employees and talk at them for an hour, right? So it's just a matter of balancing for the team, for the individual, where are they at right now. But I think most people err on the side of too little. So I would say naturally push a little bit harder towards spending more time on training and mentoring than you probably do. Yeah?
We ship software every week, and that really changes how our organization works. And there are a lot of people. So one question I have for you is, would you recommend doing trainings before the release of the software or after? And the issue, we've done both, and they both have issues. I want to know your take. When we do it before, people just kind of don't pay attention because there's not really impacting their work today. So like, oh, you're gonna have to click this and then drag that. Oh yeah, whatever. And then they're like, on their phone or whatever. And then if you do it after, it's too late. Now you're live, and now people sort of panic because they don't know what to do. So how do you when's the right time to do training as you release?
Totally.
Release email doesn't crash.
Right. So the question was basically, especially if you're on a really fast cadence and you're releasing every week or something, when's the right time to do training? Do you do it before you release? Do you do it after? There are trade-offs and risks to each. One clarifying question for me, when you're talking about sort of changes in the software and doing training on that, are you talking about training for end users or for the other people doing the implementation work? Okay. Okay. Yeah, so I should clarify, when I'm talking about training here, I'm focused more on training within the implementation team. It's really focused on like sharing technical expertise among the developers on a project. In terms of end user training, I think the easiest thing to do is actually decouple your software release cycle from your user release cycle a little bit. This problem comes up a lot, at UA, we're a SaaS company, right? And so our engineering team wants to move incredibly fast, release everything as soon as it's ready, continuous deployment, and that feels great, and you get stuff out very quickly. On the other end, we have enterprise customers who are going, whoa, 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 what's with all the changes? Like, don't keep changing everything all the time. And so what we actually do is sort of bundle up the engineering changes into slightly slower releases, which gives the product marketing and user experience and documentation folks time to catch up and deliver training. It gives account managers time to reach out to people and say, hey, this is coming. Are you ready for it? What can we do to help you get ready? So it depends a lot on what type of product you're delivering. If you've got customers who are early adopters who are chomping at the bit to get the stuff all the time, then maybe you do a weekly webcast. Here's what's new. We're going to walk you through a quick screencast of changes. But where you can, if you can decouple the engineering cycle a little bit from the end user impacting release cycle, you just give yourself breathing room, and yeah, you get a little more space. One more question. Go back there. Yes.
But when you do less code review, you deliver a lot of features, but how much scalable is the product is a question. So how to find the optimum between code reviews and coding?
Sure, that's a really good question. So most of the teams I work with have a rule, roughly 2 engineers need to sign off on a change before it goes out. So in that sort of situation, you should be doing a couple of reviews for every review you submit. So it becomes sort of self-regulating, right? There's always going to be a queue of reviews that are waiting. But if you sort of keep yourself honest and know, like, I should do as much work for other people as I am creating for them, then great. You're like super productive. You blaze through your feature. It's out. You're waiting for reviews. Well, while you're waiting for reviews is a great time to go do 2 to sort of balance the scales. So if you can set up that kind of feedback loop, then it can work pretty well. Then everybody's just sort of making their best effort to code and review sort of in equal proportion. That doesn't account for the fact that not all reviews are created equal. You can pick up a 1-line change to the UI, read it, approve it in 30 seconds. You could pick up a 300 file change that's a major refactoring. That's a much bigger project, and so you have to sort of do the mental balancing there. Although that latter kind of review, I think most code review tools and processes break down anyway, and you probably need to get people into a room to talk about it rather than just sort of do asynchronous comments. So I'm trying to think if there's a more concrete answer than do as many as you create. But I think that's really the thing I would emphasize. Just like try to do as much review work for your team as you generate for them. Because then it's self-regulating. And if you move really fast and you generate a lot of code, you'll get the sort of pushback of doing reviews to sort of equalize it out. And hopefully, and I have a whole separate talk that I'd love to give sometime on how to do code reviews and make those really functional, but hopefully that's beneficial enough to sort of the overall team output that you don't feel like it's hurting your performance. It's actually just bringing everybody else up and helping everybody move faster and deliver good stuff. So, all right, thanks.